Hey everyone, welcome back. So, last unit we saw this half-century period of comparative peace during which a handful of really interesting things happened. We saw the developments of these military orders and the interesting political dynamic that emerges as a result of having multiple politically independent military forces, for all intents and purposes, under a kingdom. Uh, we'll see that go places in the next unit, especially. But for the biggest part, for our purposes this week, it's interesting to see that half century as a period of relative peace, where there's not a dedicated effort to rid the Holy Land of these new Crusader kingdoms. And that breaks down at the beginning of this unit. It's led by characters named Imad ad-Din Zengi and his successor and heir, Nur ad-Din. Now, they do articulate for the first time this sort of dedicated, coherent message of jihad and attempt to create some kind of unity in the local context and use that unity to force Crusader kingdoms out. Now, what's the balance there? Is it create unity for the purpose of forcing the Crusader kingdoms out, or conquer Crusader kingdoms as a means of creating unity? In other words, what's the real motivation here? Was this a cynical, calculating thing? Maybe. There's a little bit of evidence for that, really. I mean, what better way to advance one's political ambitions than to advance a jihad, to become the leader and the defender of the faith, if you will? There, after all, was never a better unifier than a common enemy, and the Crusaders make a perfect target for that, potentially. Of course, it's possible that's too cynical. After all, it doesn't really take a huge stretch of the imagination to see the Crusaders as the kind of existential threat, or at least external threat, aimed at the faith for which the concept of jihad at the societal level had been originally developed. It is perfectly plausible that this was motivated truly as a genuine sort of attempt to rid the oppressors, or rid Islam of its oppressors. Now, this is similar to the debate in a number of ways that we saw over the First Crusade. And we moderns, we always have to ruminate on this issue of, you know, religious motivations. We tend to be pretty cynical as a group. We tend to see historical actors as little versions of ourselves who are mostly exploiting religion for our own personal gain. Is that fair? Is that accurate? It's hard to say, but it seems maybe unlikely. In reality, I expect that Imad ad-Din Zengi and Nur ad-Din's motives were, like most questions of motivation, a blend here. It's perfectly compatible to have a genuine and earnest desire to improve the condition of one's religion while also recognizing and counting on the political, personal benefits of doing so. Either way, they're pretty successful at first. Well, let me say actually that they're met with considerable opposition in their message, right? Fear of Zengi ultimately drives people into the arms of an alliance with the Crusader kingdom. But despite some suspicion, they're successful in their political objectives. In 1144, one of the Crusader states, the county of Edessa, is conquered by Zengi. And that, of course, sends shockwaves throughout the European population. Crusader kingdoms are under attack, right? And after half a century of legend about the First Crusade and the popularity of those crusaders, the next generation, or maybe in some cases even two generations later, is eager to prove themselves similarly. It's considered that bold action will be required if we're to, prevent the fall of these crusader kingdoms that we cherish so much, such as the thoughts of Europeans back in the Latin West. And what more logical a response than another crusade? On the face of it, it seems pretty obvious, but there is a challenge that has to be overcome first, which is the issue of the fact that the First Crusade was defined as a heavily armed pilgrimage, essentially, a pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre, almost by chance, with the ancillary objective of freeing Jerusalem, as it were, from its Islamic captors. That doesn't make any sense, as we saw with the chronology, but that was the message. That message can't work in this current context. It can't serve the strategic objectives of an extended campaign. So the message of the crusade, the concept of the crusade, has to be fundamentally recast to fit this new context. And that's where we turn to Bernard of Clairvaux, our monk reformer who championed the Cistercian monastic order, who championed in many ways the Knights Templar that we saw last week, now is the principal proponent of this Second Crusade, with the backing of the papacy, to be sure, but who's really responsible for generating the support, this time not a pope like Urban II in the First Crusade, but an outspoken reformist monk, Bernard of Clairvaux. So Bernard recast this message, and I'm interested to see your analysis of how he does that. So pay attention, compare Bernard's message for how this crusade is going to be different, and fundamentally why in the first place God allows the Muslims to defeat one of the Crusader kingdoms and pose a threat. And your reward will be a pretty interesting narrative. Meanwhile, this recasting of the crusade that you'll get to analyze here has some long-term consequences, but it also has some more immediate consequences. It helps us to explain, in particular, the Wendish Crusade. The Wendish Crusade, as you'll see, is a campaign ultimately aimed at the forced conversion of these pagan Germanic Wends living in modern Eastern Germany slash, I guess they're more Slavic than Germanic, slash Poland, which is different, right? That looks nothing like a crusade. It's aimed at forced conversion, like none of the crusades so far have been, except sort of the Peasants' Crusade and the Jews. It is aimed at Europe rather than aimed abroad. On the face of it, this looks as different as the Peasants' Crusade does to the First Crusade. Except unlike the Peasants' Crusade, which happened without papal sanction and indeed, earned sort of reprobation for its participants in many cases, the Wendish Crusade is sponsored by the Pope. He agrees. He signs off on it. Bernard of Clairvaux, in fact, signs off on it when he's there in Saxony and the Germans are saying, look, we've got some enemies of God right over there across the border. Can we go force them to convert? And sure. And they all have to take, oaths never to sign a peace unless it involves baptism, as it were, of the Wends. So the fact that that becomes an official sponsored crusade is fascinating, and it relies in a large way upon the redefinition of the crusade. And we'll see that expand into further directions in Europe. Meanwhile, the Second Crusade, total fiasco. You'll get to read about all the details, but nothing goes right about it at all. In fact, it leaves the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a significantly worse position than it was before, principally because they prove Nur ad-Din right. They prove that, Crusaders can't be trusted because now they're attacking their allies. But one of the most interesting aspects of it is this character, Eleanor of Aquitaine, that you'll get to read all about. And whether it's fair or not, and I have some suspicions about it, but whether it's fair or not, Eleanor is blamed in some ways for the failure of the Second Crusade for her Cersei Lannister-esque shenanigans. You'll get to see. Either way, Eleanor is a very interesting character because she inherits control over Aquitaine and marries the King of France, Louis VII. And, really she controls a bigger chunk of France than Louis does directly. This is why she has so much sway, why if she wants to go on crusade, nobody can tell her no, even if it's not customary for a queen to go on crusade. In fact, the very fact that there's royalty on crusade is a new development here, and shows you some of the shift in the political and social context of this crusade vis-a-vis the First Crusade, and its growing popularity and importance as a movement. Anyway, after the crusade, for reasons you'll see, Louis and Eleanor conveniently find that they're closely related and annul their marriage. And this will be one of the more interesting geopolitical consequences of the Second Crusade, because Eleanor will remarry Henry II, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, and soon to be King of England, who will also conquer Ireland. In other words, we get the rise of something called the Angevin Empire after the dynasty in England Henry creates, the Angevin dynasty. And for a little while there, it'll turn out that the kings of England, by virtue of that inheritance, end up controlling almost half of France. That will get reversed in a while, but it's an interesting kind of inversion where you have someone who's technically a vassal of France, because King of England's also the Duke of Normandy, and yet controls more of France than the king does. Pretty cool stuff. All right, so have fun with this week's readings insofar as it's possible to have fun with any of this, and keep an eye out especially for how the concept of the crusade is reframed. Well, you'll see me again next week.